Welcome back. You're watching The Globe. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has signed into law a new refugee bill that allows asylum seekers easier access to education and opportunities to integrate and earn a living. It comes just 6 months before a planned shutdown by the authorities of 2 camps housing more than 500,000 refugees. The authorities say that the Kakuma and Dadaab refugee camps have been used as breeding grounds for terrorists blamed for some of the worst attacks on Kenyan soil. Kenya has hosted some of the world's largest numbers of refugees for decades. More than 500,000 refugees, mainly from Somalia and South Sudan. Refugees International has welcomed President Kenyatta's signing of the Refugees Bill into law. Refugees International Senior Fellow Sarah Miller said that the law will improve Kenya's refugee response by working towards a whole-of-government approach. Miller added that this will unlock the potential for refugees in the country to contribute significantly to Kenya's economy. Well, she joins us now via Zoom to talk a little bit more about this. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the program, Sarah Miller. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Nice to join you.
All right. So this is a good step, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think we are cautiously optimistic that this could have the potential for some improvements. Now, of course, the details will be where the rubber meets the road, if you will. That's what we're really waiting to see, how some of the specifics come out. But what this new law does do is open the door to some potential improvements that are important. As you mentioned in your lead-in, Kenya has hosted large numbers of refugees for many, many years. And while Kenya deserves credit for that, there's also been a denial of many rights, most importantly for long-term populations, the right to work and freedom of movement. And so it's hoped that this new law, and we'll be watching very carefully, will show some improvement. There's reference to social and economic integration, which are incredibly important, both for refugees and for host areas. So there is potential here. And there's also potential for additional support and restructuring that could improve, as you said, make up more of a whole of government approach where more parts of government are involved in refugee issues. And some improvements there as well, perhaps with refugee status determination. So yes, we're watching carefully, waiting to see how some of the details come out, but optimistic that there's potential here.
All right. I mean, one talks about refugees and their Kenyan hosts finding an opportunity to thrive. What will that mean, actually? What will that look like if this bill does what it's supposed to do?
Well, if it does indeed open the door to additional social and economic integration, there's a lot of potential. We're actually about to release a report, that shows the potential that refugees have to contribute to their local economies. Many in refugee hosting areas are already very familiar with this. Refugees bring skills, experience, knowledge, their own labor abilities, and can add to those local markets. So there's a lot of untapped resources if refugees are able to move further beyond the camps and access work permits to a greater degree. Currently, refugees are technically able to access work permits, but very few are actually able to do so in reality. The paperwork, the administrative burden is very onerous. So it's hoped that this law and then additional steps beyond it will help improve access to the labor market for refugees and improve the conditions for the host communities as well, which can reduce tensions, but also stimulate the economy, which is much needed in Kenya, as in many other parts of the world that have been severely affected by the pandemic and other conditions. So there's a lot of potential here. Kenya has shown some openness to economic inclusion in other examples. The Kalobei refugee settlement is one example where there has been more openness to let refugees move more freely and have better access to livelihoods. But there's a lot of improvement to be made. So again, we're hoping that this law opens the door to that and are keen to see how the specifics play out.
There's a couple of things, large issues that Kenya has raised in terms of why it's feeling that it needs to shut down these refugee camps. And we'll talk about both of them. But let's start with the fact that they feel 500,000 refugees in these camps. They just don't have the resources, and that perhaps they should have got more assistance to help with their work in housing all these refugees.
It's a fair point. It's a fair question. And Kenya has hosted some of the largest numbers for some of the longest periods of time. And there's no doubt that on the global scale, that the majority of the world's refugees are hosted by smaller numbers of countries, usually in the neighboring regions. And I'm sitting here in the US, and we take very small numbers of refugees for resettlement. So it's a very fair point. And responsibility sharing is at the heart of a lot of the international conversations that are continuing to evolve among donors, the United Nations, international organizations. Kenya has received, and there's a very active international community, as many of your viewers surely know. There are vast programs and there has been investment, but there certainly is room to do more. One of the things that has been promising in recent years has been new agreements, the Global Refugee Compact, new investments by financing institutions like the World Bank, to improve financing and assistance and support to large refugee hosting countries like Kenya. So arguably there should continue to be improvements and increases in the types of assistance that Kenya receives, and particularly if it's demonstrating an openness to policies that move beyond long-term encampment. All actors agree that long-term encampment is not a solution. Certainly refugees do not benefit from being penned up in camps for decades, generations in many cases. And certainly Kenya has an interest in not having camps continue for decades and decades. So there is agreement that does not constitute a long-term solution, but I think it's fair to emphasize that additional responsibility sharing from the international community in the form of funding and other types of programs and resettlement by other countries should also be included and on the table in these conversations.
All right, we'll talk about what next just now. But the other concern that they had is that these camps, they say, are breeding ground for insurgents and all types of insecurity. Is that something that you have seen and that there is a genuine concern?
It is understandable that Kenya prioritizes its security concerns, and certainly attacks in recent years justify a focus on security. But Kenya, like many other states, should be careful about associating refugees, and the US does this as well, with security concerns and terrorism. The vast majority of refugees have no linkages to terrorist groups or security concerns. All refugees have fled for their lives. And many are there precisely for the reason that they have fled terrorism and other violence that has threatened them. So I would be very cautious to use those types of arguments, though they are a common political rhetoric. And security concerns, of course, are the concern of any state. But arguably many, actually in the local communities, a recent survey that we cite shows that many favor allowing refugees to work freely, to move freely, and do not always match some of the concerns that we hear at the rhetoric at the national level. So I'm always hesitant when security arguments are put forth. And I think the camp model is not necessarily something that should be linked to terrorist concerns. What should be a concern is long-term encampment in general, being a denial of people's rights, not a humane way for people to live out to their fullest potential, and also missing out on the opportunities. So I think there's agreement that the camps should not be a long-term solution, but I would not associate, the vast majority of refugees do not have linkages to terrorist groups.
All right, so if we agree then that long-term encampments is not the way, these camps have been there a long time, so that perhaps there should be movement towards something different. What does that something different look like? What should Kenya be doing to start shutting down these camps and making sure that when they are shut, that these refugees are safe wherever it is that they go to next?
Absolutely. I think what you've just said is the the priority should be around safety and security and human rights, not on closing camps as quickly as possible without prioritizing those who are living in them. We've been very concerned in many years where there have been statements to close the camps because they've often been driven by security rhetoric that frightens people and this kind of haste and rush. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. You cannot quickly close down a camp like that. And UNHCR and other international organizations have been working to come up with a plan that systematically thinks about the types of solutions available. Certainly under international law, and Kenya abides by this, people should not be returned to a place of persecution where their lives would be in danger. So people cannot be forced back to the countries they have fled if there's still a threat there. So any type of repatriation needs to be carefully considered. Sending any refugee back needs to be carefully considered in partnership with the UN and other organizations that are working on this to ensure that people are not being returned to a place where they would be in danger. But there are a lot of integration opportunities, and Kenya is already realizing some of these in recent years and has shown openness to this. Other countries in the region have had other models as well. Uganda and Ethiopia is in crisis right now, but in recent years has also shown openness to other types of settlements, which again do not require people to reside in camps, but give people choice about where they live, access to services, opportunities to pursue livelihoods. These types of models show a lot of promise, not just for accessing human rights, but for the economic gain of the host country as well. So I think that's really the place to start for Kenya. I think Kenya has an opportunity to show a lot of leadership in the humanitarian sphere on this. And our research in other countries is really showing that it does make sense financially as well. Yeah. Perhaps not in the immediate crisis phase where the needs are very acute, but over time, refugees contribute. They pay taxes, they create businesses, and they become contributing members of society that ultimately generate a lot of gains for the host country. So I think that is the starting place for Kenya. Certainly continuing to respect its obligations under international law, but considering how more openness in terms of access to work opportunities, to decent work, not just the informal sector where refugees may be exploited or vulnerable to other types of threats, but to decent work alongside the host community that also needs that. So I think that is really the starting point. And I think Kenya has started to experiment with those models with some success. And the international community is also learning how to do this better and move away from the camp model. But I think any rush to close down the camps would be a mistake. Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of people are there, and therefore it needs to be a long-term process.
All right. I look at countries like Kenya and maybe even Uganda, who seem to have more than their fair share of refugees. Is there any reason why some of the neighboring states are not picking up the same level of responsibility?
It's a good question, and it's kind of the global question that those of us in policy research and academia and advocacy continue to confront. Certainly many states like Kenya, like Uganda, do host more than their fair share. Some of that is by nature of geography, neighboring states that are in crisis. Kenya is certainly preparing if a number of refugees flee from Ethiopia for a new influx potentially. And it happens to be in a neighborhood where there is a lot of displacement. So some of that is inevitable. It's where people choose to go. And also Kenya and states like Uganda should also feel proud of upholding their obligations under international and domestic law that they have embraced, even though it's been difficult. And again, it's up to the international community then to pony up, if you will, to really step up and offer additional support. And that comes down to donor states, to financing institutions, to the UN, many of which are already doing quite a bit and have heavy investments, but certainly need to do more rather than just tell these countries to continue hosting for long periods of time. And again, that view of durable solutions, of how people can move beyond their situation of displacement and giving people choice and ownership. Right? Refugees are individual people like we are who have skills and knowledge and the capacity to make decisions over what's best for them. And so those are kind of critical in thinking about how to respond. But it's absolutely true that the international community can and should do more for many of these large refugee hosting countries. There has been a push for this in recent years. There's new momentum around this, and there certainly is a lot more to be done.
Senior Fellow at Refugees International, Sarah Miller, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.